Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
Kristin Hoganson. I am a professor of history at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign.
fantastic. And behind you, Prof, I see a lot of filing cabinets. Are you truly opening them often, or is more of what you do digital or literally in archives in libraries and so on?
Oh, wow. Yeah. So one of them has food in it. One of them has off-season clothes. I mean, that one drawer, right? Not the entire cabinet, in case I get caught in the rain on the way in. But most of them are notes, some from past books. But I would say about five or six of the drawers have things from the book I'm working on now. And I have everything that I can in electronic format, but I also have far too many printouts. But it helps with my writing method. And I have a lot of visual materials for the work I'm doing now. And so it's helpful for me to be able to lay all those images out flat and look at them.
Well, it would be great to talk about that current work, but first I've got this taster question that I pose to people, which is to inquire what's currently dynamizing, preoccupying, impeding, interesting you. What's going on for the prof?
Yeah, well, current events, right, are just horrifyingly all-consuming and coming so rapidly that it's just impossible to stay on top of them. So I think sometimes I'm like trying to retreat from that and just carve out space not to be thinking about it. But as you know, at the time of this interview, the US has just attacked Iran, right? And how can one not think about that? And then all the other events that have been relentlessly in the news recently. So that's sort of my mental space. But as I said, I'm also working on a book. And I'm technically on a NEH fellowship this semester. So that's National Endowment for the Humanities. And I say technically because it was yanked by the Trump administration when they took office on some really personally nasty grounds. Like I was accused of being, it was a form letter, so it's not just me, but like unpatriotic, anti-American, and for advancing woke gender ideology, which made me laugh because my proposal was to study US military engineering. So maybe there's something going on with military engineers with their woke gender ideology that like I didn't even know about, but the Trump people knew about. So technically, I'm on a fellowship to write. So I'm not teaching this semester. So when you say, what am I thinking about, is my current research. And I feel like I'm trying so hard to carve out time to work on that, that there are days when I'm just in my own headspace, right? Like I'm losing my capacity to talk. That's one of the reasons why it's so great to do this interview, because I'm just spending all my time with those notes and those file cabinets and trying to, I have tens of thousands of pages of things, right? Like trying to organize them and figure out how they fit together and how I can produce a storyline and something compelling out of all that research.
I'm sorry to hear about the fellowship. One of my books is one of the 300 odd censored from the Naval Academy. It's not allowed to be read. So I was one of the early authors nominated as risky, perilous,
Yeah.
pointless, stupid.
Wow. So which book is that and how did you even find out?
The New York Times published a list of them,
Okay.
and the publisher got in touch with those of us who were included in the list. There were about 5 people who'd published books with Temple, and I was one of them. The book is called Sports Sex, so I guess the title was enough to send these people over the top.
Yeah.
Yeah, the New York Times made a big deal out of this censorship, and the books, as far as we know, weren't burnt, but they've been locked away so that the beating hearts of naval cadets cannot be sent into an arrhythmic propulsion.
I love how you put that. Yeah, so hopefully they'll unlock those books and let naval cadets read freely at some point.
Now, I've got a question for you about the engineering stuff, Prof, because I work in the global south, so I can't get hold of your books and many of your articles, right? They're not available to people here. But I have read a couple of your really brilliant articles, one of which is about New Orleans, where I used to live, and a place I deeply love, and I can tell you do too. It's a magnificent environmental, imperial, colonial history. Really amazing. I mean, I learned an incredible amount from reading it. Did your interest in the Army Corps of Engineers, as it were, get going in concert at all with your research into New Orleans?
Oh, that's so interesting. So let me explain what that article was all about. So I was president of the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations the year that COVID hit. And we were supposed to have an in-person conference in NOLA, New Orleans, and we had to take it down. So that was like the defining act of my presidency, right? It was like how to take down the conference without the organization going bankrupt. And then I had zero experience taping anything, but since I couldn't deliver the address in person, then I had to deliver it as a taped address, right? So then the next challenge was like, how do I tape myself, right? And I got help from my kids who were really good at you're saying all the time and you need to edit out your awkwardness and silences. So I posted it as a tape thing, and it was supposed to be a luncheon address in person in New Orleans where I would talk about being present in a particular place as a foreign relations historian and thinking about place-based understandings of foreign relations history. And part of it was how we think of empire as people located in the United States as something that happens out there. But of course, it happens at home in the homeland or, continental United States as well. And so it was to think about histories of empire that shoot through places. And New Orleans just has so many rich examples for that. And so there was a little bit in that talk about military engineering because I was moving more in an environmental history direction. But that is not how I ended up writing about engineering projects. So my most recent book was on the US heartland. And it took my hometown, not hometown, but the town where I'm living now in East Central Illinois as a starting point for a global history. And it counters a lot of myths about the heartland as the ethno-nationalist safe space at the core of the nation that needs to be protected at all costs. It's bounded from the rest of the world, et cetera, by following leads wherever they took me. And there was a lot, surprisingly, in one of the chapters on engineering because this part of Illinois was super swampy. And it was Ostfrieslanders who brought European drainage techniques that they had used to like build dikes to keep the North Sea out of the farm field, to create the farm fields of the Netherlands and Western Germany, tiled and drained the wet prairies, making some of the most significant engineering works on the planet, right? Enough tiles in the 19th century that they could have circled the Earth 6 times, but you can't see them because they're underground. Although if you follow things like the dead zone off the coast of Louisiana, that's the agricultural runoff from the Midwest that all the tiling and draining is exacerbating. So I was interested in engineering from that, but having been writing on the Midwest and realizing that the Midwest is often an understudied part of the country, I thought, okay, next I'll do the Great Lakes. And I was interested in settler colonial histories in the US Canadian borderlands. And I was digging around for different leads. And when I got to hydroelectric projects, I was really surprised to see that US Canadian cooperation in places like the Niagara Falls era not only involved taking indigenous um, waters and homelands in North America, but they downstreamed to places like Mexico where there were US Canadian collaborations. And so I thought, whoa, I did not know that as a historian of US empire. I always think of the US as being a kind of a act alone power, and that engineers from the US were collaborating with Canadians in a significant way was news to me. So now I know that there's actually a scholarship on it, but I didn't really know at the time. So I started following the leads I got, and it turned out I got so many that the Canadian angle disappeared a little bit. But it's the book that I'm working on is on US involvement and infrastructural projects in the Caribbean area. So basically going from Mexico to Colombia, a little Venezuela, but the US wasn't so involved in Venezuela in my time period, which I'll explain in a second. And then some attention to places like Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, where the US was also deeply involved. And I had to finally focus it more on civil engineering projects that have a fossil fuel angle because that's one of the things that interests me is fossil fuel takeoff. And so I focus on railroads, then highway building, and then ultimately um, electricity production. And so how I'm thinking of it in part is like empire building via infrastructural systems. Or another way of looking at it is as the Belt and Road projects of the bad neighbor era. And by bad neighbor era, I'm thinking of the first decades of the 20th century, which are a time period of US military interventions in the Caribbean region. One of the time periods of US military interventions, but a significant time period in that respect. And a lot of the interventions have an infrastructure component because one of the justifications is that countries that had borrowed money for infrastructure building would default and the Europeans would go in. So it's to prevent the Europeans from going in. But there's also one of the chapters that I still need to draft, but I've been thinking about it a bit, is the concession protection racket, where the US government is backing up concessionaires. So I could go on for hours on all the different angles of the book. There's angles of financialization, of economic linkage, of labor management, of building systems like corporate systems that become de facto public systems. So like if the United Fruit Company or a mining company is going to build a railroad, it becomes the public transportation system. But it was never really intended to benefit the public, right? It was always intended to benefit the concession holder. So there are a lot of different angles to it. And so that's what I'm working on now.
That's incredibly exciting, really, really exciting. And when you talk about starting off in the so-called heartland, the Midwest, and so on, I'm reminded of this other fabulous article you wrote about the two McKinleys of the Midwest and how they do and don't incarnate the current president's fantasies about what President McKinley stood for. And this is, in fact, another presidential address. So I've got to ask you, Prof, how many of these associations have you been president of?
Oh, hundreds. No,
Hundreds.
just two. Just two,
And
and you found them both. So good for you.
well, I think it's because they've taken pity on, indigent scribes and have made them available. They're wonderfully detailed, brilliantly, analytically interesting and enlightening and just fantastic. But anyway, your point in this is that McKinley, this came out about 7 years ago, so you probably wrote it in the first year or two of Trump's first presidency, during which the orange-headed monster invoked the name of McKinley and still does all the time because, tariffs are the most wonderful thing in the world. You point out, A, that McKinley moved away from being pro-tariffs, and B, that his namesake in another part of the Midwest, a congressman, was in fact intimately involved, as was everybody in US politics, in bringing in people, seeds, technologies, ideas, insects, pests, you name it, from all over the bloody world. It's a brilliantly made point. And I wish that the journalists, so-called, who are the US DC press corps, had taken your classes, because then they could ask the spluttering fool, what do you think about what Prof. Hoganson says? And he can say, don't worry about her, the NEH has fixed her, we've stitched her up. But it is a bravura, a brilliant piece, I think. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about that sense of the United States as, in many ways, not being as isolationist as conventional discourse would have it, in that account of the 19th century in particular.
Yeah, so I'm 7 years is a long time ago, so I'm trying to think back on what was the point of the piece. But I think you put your finger exactly on it because it was a time of emphasizing wall building, right? So not only tariff walls, but also the literal wall on the US-Mexican border as the defining achievement of the first Trump administration. And so I was writing that address in that context. And one of the things that had struck me about Trump's statements about McKinley and about the Midwest were that they fit into longstanding stereotypes of the Midwest as the isolationist heart of the United States and as the wall building part of the United States. And as I said at the very beginning, that was one of the things that I was pushing back against in my Heartland book. And that book took a place that might seem stereotypically local, which is the rural Midwest, in the stereotypically most local times, which is the years between the European and indigenous struggles for domination in North America and World War I, when everybody started to recognize that the United States was an ascendant power that was deeply involved around the world. So I took the years in between and found, lo and behold, it was not this isolationist, cut off place that, as you said, they were importing the means of production, they were importing the genetic material for agriculture, including things like Italian honeybees and Scottish cattle and Berkshire hogs that had genetic material from China that gave them like a 5,000-year shortcut in terms of pork production. And they were importing seeds from all over the place, including soy, which is just fundamental to the corn belt now. There were international students who were on land grant campuses. There were indigenous people who were struggling for the right to return to their homeland, some of whom were living in Mexico because of U.S. removal policies and efforts to escape the long reach of the U.S. Federal government. And there were all kinds of political commitments, including, I discovered, the congressman from the district that I live in, who was also named William McKinley in the same time as President McKinley, who people think of President McKinley, I guess, because of Trump, as the tariff guy, but previously he was known mostly as the War of 1898 guy, right? The guy who got us into the war in Cuba, and then Puerto Rico, the annexation of Hawaii, the Philippines, and Guam. So I think President McKinley is known as this arch imperialist. And it turns out that Congressman McKinley, who served for a very long time in the House and then the Senate, was like big in the foreign relations, Foreign Affairs Committee, belonged to an organization. In fact, he was a leader in it called the Inter-Parliamentary Union, which was an early exercise in global governance. But it was a white supremacist organization that was all about the US and Northern Europe and British settler colonies. And the idea was that it would be an instrument for global imperial domination. And I forget how many cross-Atlantic trips he made. I think it was 15 round trips, right? So 30 back and forths total in the age of steam, right? We're talking before air travel. And he did Caribbean tours and some around the world cruises where he went to places like the US occupied Philippines and to Cuba and the Panama Canal Zone when the canal was being constructed, and was an arch imperialist, and spoke a lot about the need to colonize the places where the US had waged war and were involved in various occupations. And so to think about him indicates, again, it's not just President McKinley, but a much deeper bench of people in the Midwest who were involved in imperial activities in the early 20th century, late 19th century. And I'll just say one more thing about Congressman McKinley is when he came back from his tours to places like the Philippines, he thought, oh, I'm so expert, right? I've been to the Philippines, so I can talk about how great the US war there is, how great the occupation of the Philippines on the part of the US military is, and I will just be the definitive voice on that. But there were students in his district from the Philippines. So he was not the only person. And there were also a lot of people from the district who served in the military in the Philippines, who became involved in agricultural projects in the Philippines, missionary projects in the Philippines. And then in his district in World War I, Air Force Base was built. That has to do with the tiling and draining that I've been talking about, right? Because once they take the water out of a place that seasonally had been basically a lake, right? You could have rode 5 miles across the countryside in the wetter months of the year. Once that was drained and turned to like corn production, it was suitable for an Air Force base in the era of biplanes. And so in the World War I era, they established an Air Force base and they brought pilots in from the US military, from the Philippines, as well as from the Pershing punitive expedition in northern Mexico to teach people how to fly at this Air Force base. So there were people like in the base with extensive experience in the Philippines who brought those politics with them. And just to give you one example, they couldn't train there in the wintertime because of the snow and the ice. So they would all get on trains and ride the trains down to Texas for the winter air training where they would sing songs like "We're coming to kill the greasers." It just gives you a sense of the racism that was so deeply embedded in their military experiences. So again, to think of the Midwest as this vulnerable place, like Trump kept talking about, the place that has been screwed over by the whole rest of the world, is a place of weakness, vulnerability. It has to be protected. Hides long histories of empire building, including from the rural Midwest, right? That he just was not flagging as historically super important to say the standard of living that people in the United States overall have enjoyed.
And of course, an interesting point to bear in mind is that in its distinguished history, the University of Illinois, I don't know what it's like right now, but has come to have one of the highest proportions of overseas students of any school, private or public, in the United States, along with places like Berkeley, NYU, Michigan, etc. Right? In one of your articles that I read, you have photographs of some of these folks who'd come from the Philippines to live in the central Midwest, right? That you mentioned.
Yeah, and one of the things I didn't talk about when I said there were students from the Philippines in McKinley's district is they joined with students from places like India and China and Mexico in an organization called the Cosmopolitan Club that eventually became networked with other student organizations on different campuses. And I don't have great transcripts of all the things that went down in the Cosmopolitan Club meetings, but I do have some student newspaper reportage on them. And from that reportage, it is clear that they were advancing anti-colonial politics, right? So then that's just a fascinating thing to think of, even in the first decade of the 20th century, to think of campuses in the rural Midwest as being hotbeds of anti-colonial nationalism, where students from what we now call like the global South were networking across different geographies on behalf of struggles for
See,
self-government.
I think Trump knows this, and that's another reason why you were defenestrated from your National Endowment for the Humanities grant. He,
Okay, right. I'm sure he read it. I'm sure he's a secret intellectual who stays up late at night reading NEH grants.
that's got
And
it.
that he would understand what the NEH grants say. I'm like positive that is the secret Trump that nobody has ever realized existed.
Now, Prof, going back to your New Orleans work, and I will stop talking about asking you about things that I happen to have read, but that's where I feel most informed because I want to learn about your books from you as if I were the same kind of naive inquirer as many listeners may be. In that article that's impressed me so much, you turn on its head an expression that I'm very used to, outposts of empire, and instead refer to the obverse. You call them imposts of empire, not imposts, but imposts. And you take New Orleans as an example. Can you tell us a little bit about the way in which you want foreign relations and domestic relations to be tied together by historians? Because I think that's your wider point, isn't it?
Well, that was the point of that particular essay. I mean, that's not my only intellectual project, but that essay followed on the heels of the Heartland book, which I think people in my field of U.S. foreign relations history and the history of U.S. imperialism, I think some of them see the title, The Heartland in American History, and think, like, I don't need to read this because it's about like navel gazing, right? It's about when the first trolley went in and the first Presbyterian church, the kinds of things that antiquarian histories are known for, right? Local histories of a certain vein. But I see that book as a history of empire. And it's not only empire in the Philippines, in Cuba, in Panama, in Puerto Rico, etc. It's also empire in the rural Midwest, right? The seemingly on imperial part of the country and a lot of nationalist mythology. So I tried to do something similar in the New Orleans piece, tying the conceptual framework of the whole book to the conference site for the conference that never happened. And again, the point is that empire isn't just something that US people have the privilege of thinking happens elsewhere, but it is threaded through every single local history in the United States because this is a country that is a settler colonial nation, right? Like it's built on the killing and dispossession of indigenous people. And if that's not imperialist, you tell me what empire is all about. And every single overseas action has connected communities in the United States to overseas actions, right? And I can't even remember what I talk about in the article, but just things like, naval building in World War II and the plants and the animals, immigration streams, like refugees from Vietnam, the layers. And one of the things I love about New Orleans is the layers of colonial occupation that are like visible in the street signs and the languages that are on the streets, on the buildings, and so forth. You just can't disentangle any part of US history from histories of empire building is the point. And so that's the impost, right? That is, you don't just look outside the borders of the United States, of the outposts is where you find it, but every place, right? Including in places not widely recognized as having imperial connections. And so part of it is about history. It's about having people think back through time to the layers of empire that have helped form the United States. But part of it is about geography. And it's so easy to overlook histories of connection if it's not like right in your face, right? If you're not seeing the people that the bombs are falling on right now, it's easy to just go about your life and pretend it's not happening, right? And so part of it is trying to prod more awareness or facilitate more awareness of the connections that aren't immediately palpably visible in people's everyday lives, but are nonetheless really important, right? To make the on-scene more seen.
And this takes me to the introduction that you and your co-editor wrote to your book, Crossing Empires, where, as if you were channeling the spirit of Harold Innis, you make the cable and all that it enabled a core aspect for understanding imperial history. Now, to me, that's obvious, but I don't think many international relations scholars or historians would have that as the first thing they talked about. So could you tell us a wee bit about the decision to do so, the argument for doing so, and about the book?
Wow, it's interesting that you already knew about it because I didn't know about that when we started writing the introduction. I have to say that was a co-edited volume that I co-edited with Jay Sexton, who's at the University of Missouri. And that particular book is an effort to de-exceptionalize US imperialism. And it's a collection of essays. So I didn't write all the essays, right? I just collaborated with Jay to write the introduction and put the essays together. And by de-exceptionalize, what I'm talking about is a tendency in US history writing to, if empire is acknowledged at all, and for a long time it wasn't, right? It was repressed, right? The United States was the foil to the evil empire of the Soviet Union, for example. But to the extent that historians and others had recognized empire, to treat it as something that was homegrown and exclusively US, right? So in the earliest scholarship, for example, that was super critical of US imperialism in the Vietnam War era. One important historian was William Appleman Williams, who was teaching at the University of Wisconsin at the time. And he wrote about agrarianism as a wellspring of empire. So it was farmers looking for export markets. Many of them were in the Midwest, but not all of them, right? And so they wanted things like coaling stations so that the US could have a naval presence. They wanted Panama Canal construction. They wanted like US penetration and domination of the Caribbean and Latin America to advance their agricultural exports. And if you read his account, you get the sense that the United States is this like standalone power that is just like operating in some kind of global void, exercising its increasingly robust capacity to wield force because of its manufacturing base and its agricultural base. And that approach doesn't really acknowledge how entangled the US was with other powers of the time, many of them the European powers that, especially Britain, that were exercising just so much global power in the time period. So the aim of the volume was to think about those connections, right? Like to put histories of the global exercise of US power into conversation with histories of European imperialism and to look for the connections where empires were not just competing against each other for dominance, but they were sharing ideas. There were all kinds of forms of mobility and exchange and connection and collaboration between them. So that's the takeaway of the volume as a whole. And the thing, if I remember right, that we were trying to do with the cables was that we do a little bit of material analysis of how they worked. And the first one that was so celebrated as connecting the United States to the UK, it went through Canada, right? So British Dominion, and then I'm forgetting all this stuff, but the gutta percha was a tropical product that the cable was wrapped in for insulation purposes, and that was a product of the British Empire.
From
It's just
Malaya. Yeah.
ample. And so the communications that have been understood as just like bilateral US UK communications are more layered because there are imperial forms of production and extraction and imperial geographies that are involved in producing what had been seen as a bilateral thing. So we just use that as sort of a hook, right, to lure people into the wider themes of the volume.
Now, you guys then go on to co-edit the Cambridge History of America and the World, 1820 to 1900. Can you tell us a little bit about that project?
Wow, so this is so interesting. I thought you were going to ask me about fighting for American manhood because we're fighting a war against Iraq right now. So all my prep was on that. But the Cambridge History of America and the World, it was part of a 4-volume series that Cambridge Press put out to update a previous series. The previous series was single author volumes, but their approach for this one was edited collections. And Jay and I were invited to do that volume. And so we recruited an all-star team, some really amazing scholars at different career stages to write essays on the United States and world context in that time period. And what are some of the things the volume does that earlier ones didn't do? Let me think. So the importance placed on settler colonialism, indigenous diplomacy, like among indigenous nations and then between indigenous nations in the United States, that pops out far more in that volume, I think, than a lot of previous diplomatic accounts of the time period. Also, more attention to social and cultural developments, more attention again to the kind of cross-imperial kind of connections, and yeah, just it's just a much more multi-vocal volume, I would say, right? And in part it's because it's a collaborative piece with multiple authors, but there's no like single storyline
There's no through line. I
because
understand.
of the complexity of the topic.
I apologize for having thrown curveballs at you. I hope at least they came at a gentle speed. Why,
Oh,
why don't
fine.
why don't you talk about what you felt prepared to talk about?
Well, I didn't prepare that much, but I thought that you would want to ask me about masculinity and warmongering, which was the through line of the Fighting for American Manhood book that McKinley, the President McKinley, figured in, and that book was on U.S. involvement in the wars of 1898. So the intervention in the Cuban War for independence from Spain, leading to U.S. troop landing in Puerto Rico, and also U.S. intervention in the Philippines, which then had the Guam connection and the annexation of Hawaii. And the angle in that book was to take all the statements about masculinity seriously. And what I'm talking about are the hundreds, you could probably find tens of thousands, right? Like I had to do it before anything was digitized. So I had to go through microfilm to find my sources, but it was not hard to find statements like the United States needs a war. War will build male character. We are suffering from peace rot. There were people in the time who have been labeled jingoes who clamored for war is a good in and of itself because of its implications for building a certain kind of aggressive form of masculinity that played out in different registers in the aftermath of the U.S. involvement in the Cuban War against Spain.
And this is something that becomes around the same time part of a discourse of the modern Olympic Games in the context of what is seen as the failings of masculinity that led to French defeat in the Franco-Prussian War a couple of decades earlier. And a famous article that JFK wrote when he'd been elected, but before he took office, in Sports Illustrated, about how we need to have tougher young men, and how Europeans were tougher because they walked and they took the bus.
Yeah, so that particular example is news to me, but I do think it's something that has had different resonances over time. In the time period that I write about in that book, around 1898, there were some things that were historically specific, including the supposed closing of the frontier, which had been seen as the place where white American men would go kill people to prove their manhood. The passing of the Civil War generation, which had really defined masculinity from the 1860s onward. But by 1898, Civil War veterans are dwindling in numbers. So there's a lot of nostalgia for, the men who had already passed, in the sense that they were, people weren't going to Memorial Day ceremonies in great numbers anymore. And a lot of it, which makes it different from today, in terms of calling for more virile, aggressive martial manhood, was generated by younger men who felt like they had always been looked down on by the Civil War generation for not having proven themselves in battle. And so elite men who were also suffering, elite white men, from class anxieties, feeling like in a more corporate economy, they were doing office work, they weren't doing heavy agricultural labor, they weren't doing heavy industrial work, that immigrant men were doing that, Black men were doing that. Black men were no longer forced to be, as subservient as they had been before the Reconstruction amendments. And there was a lot of anxiety about the physicality of elite white men, and the sense was, serving in not only in the military, but in combat roles would be really important for proving that they weren't all the term used at the time was dudes, right? Effeminate dudes was a common expression that they could kind of recuperate their position as people who'd be regarded as rightful leaders by demonstrating their masculinity in battle. And another angle to all this was the new woman, who was increasingly, and again, it's like, there are racial aspects and class aspects to this, but like college educated, bicycle riding, women were voting in several states even before the 19th Amendment in 1920. They were voting in a lot of local elections, school board elections, winning positions as mayor in some towns. So women were becoming more involved in politics. They were clamoring for rights. They were clamoring for better government, including for international arbitration. And so part of it was anxiety about declining male power, right? A decline in patriarchy and the capacity to dominate women if they were becoming more assertive. So I do think there were some specific things that were going on in the time period. And I don't know how much more time we have in the interview, but I got to the end. Um, One of the things that makes it different, I think, from now is nation building was also seen as a good thing, right? Like occupying the Philippines was seen as a good thing because it would teach white men to govern. And the sense is that they would develop their kind of command and control capacity through governing people that in the racist, um, discourses of the time were understood as savage or bestial or lesser people, so that nation building would kind of make the things that were gained in the process of war last longer because the governing would continue on through more time. But what happened is what happens in war, right? Like men get blown apart, right? Like they come home injured, they come home with tropical diseases, they came home with like VD, sexually transmitted diseases, they came home drunken. And then there were all kinds of reports that emerged of war crimes, right? Of the water cure, of like forcing water into through tubes into people's mouths like to just about the point of death and then stomping on them to get the water out. And so instead of like demonstrating to wider publics that this was an effective way to build manhood, the conclusion was that the imperial politics of the time were really corrosive and destructive, right? So I think the pendulum swung back as a result of the evidence that emerged from the battlefields and reportage.
Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose with the water torture.
Yeah.
And this is also the period, is it not, when much of a statuary erected, especially in the South, to the Confederacy emerges. It's in that period when they think they've beaten Reconstruction that they start to commemorate in physical form the white male leaders of the Confederacy and their so-called triumphs, both, well, triumphs from before the Civil War, as it were, but also during it, which are now held up by the right as emblems of a treasured history. But in fact, they were not erected in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. They were erected very much at this point of doubt about masculinity.
Yeah, I mean, all I can do is agree, and I guess I can spat on a little bit as well. In terms of thinking about, say, the War of 1898, it occurred in a time of growing blue-gray reunions. So as the numbers of veterans were declining, then a phenomenon started to happen, which is the Union veterans would have reunions with the Confederate veterans. And they were racist, right? That is so telling that like men who fought for the Union, but who were African American, were excluded from these gatherings or marginalized in the gatherings, just as they were like, in terms of burials, marginalized in Arlington National Cemetery. Um, and there's a big Confederate monument in Arlington National Cemetery, right? In our national cemetery, like more celebration of white Confederate veterans who fought against the United States of America than Black U.S. Army veterans who fought for the United States of America in the Civil War. But the point is, in the context of celebrating like these blue and gray reunions, it wasn't about the principles, right? It wasn't about the morality, the ethics, the like what the Confederacy stood for. The point was they were fighters, right? And what we're really honoring is the fighting spirit. Like that's what it meant to be manly, would be to go into combat, right? And the combat mattered so much that even people in the North who were Union veterans who had lost their brothers, their best friends, like people in their units who were dear to their hearts had died at the hands of Confederates. They were willing to shake their hands and honor them because they were manly fighters, right? So in part, it like made the Union sacrifices seem greater, right? Like if your enemy is a great fighter, then it enhances your own valor. But it just tells you something about like the celebration of militarism, right? Or martial masculinity, that what really matters is the fighting spirit.
Prof, I've got one more question for you, if I may. And once you've answered that, I'd like to give you the opportunity to add anything you may wish to include in addition to what we've said. And that might take the form of revisiting terrain we've covered, where there's something else you want to remark upon, or something entirely new that we haven't discussed. Does that sound all right as a means of bringing things to a close?
Go for it. I'm not sure I'll have anything just at my fingertips to throw into the mix, but I'll try to answer whatever question you lob at me.
Well, my last question is about this masculinity book. Was it demoralizing to research, read, and write these things in terms of both thinking about the past, but also resonances with the present? What was it like for you emotionally, is what I'm asking.
Oh my gosh, it was such a long time ago. So that book, the masculinity one, came out
1998.
in 1998, and it was a rush to publication because of 1898, 1998. So it was a very fast process. And I think emotionally, let me explain what things were like at the time. So I went to graduate school because I wanted to do women's history. Feminist history is the direction I took at a time when there's a historian, Joan Scott, who had published an article on gender as a useful category of historical analysis. And her point was like, women's history, sure, that matters, but there's also this analytical category, which at the time was new, right? Like now, anybody in the academy will be like, oh my God, this is like ancient history. But at the time, it was a really new thing that gender was an analytical category, like class, like race, and it could be applied not only to women, but to men and to systems, say, like sexuality, right? That gender was like a logic of how you organize society. And that as Joan Scott argued, it had implications for politics. So I read that essay in graduate school, and I'd been doing research on abolitionism and how abolitionists in the United States weren't only focusing on like rape of enslaved women, but also on like what slavery did to enslaved men, right? How it undercut Victorian understandings of masculinity. And how that was an argument then that was marshaled with moral force, right, to help explain why slavery was so evil. So I'd been doing research on that, but then I started to dig around a little bit on the late 19th century. And again, like the masculinity stuff was everywhere, right? Like you can't open the congressional record and read about debates about war policy without people talking about what we need is real men. And like, if we're going to go to war, I'm going to like be the first to enlist, and making a men and nations analogy, like just as a real man would stand up to in a front, then the nation has to stand up to in a front, and men embody the nation, and the nation's all about male character. If we don't have masculine men, the whole nation's going to go up in flames. It was just ubiquitous. And so then I thought, okay, I'll take the theories from Joan Scott and run with them. And then I am going back to your question in terms of the emotional aspect of that is I was young, and I just felt everyone would talk in like women's history circles about like, I don't know, they wouldn't use like the term the big guys, but they were kind of thinking that, right? Like the senior people in the field were men, right? It was such a male dominated field, like diplomatic history is what it was called at the time, or foreign relations history. And there were certain conversations, like the realist school, the idealist, that they were like fighting those same battles, sometimes it seemed over and over again. And they weren't really all that receptive to cultural veins of analysis or social history veins of analysis, which had just taken over the whole profession in the 60s and 70s. And so I think the emotion was like, I found stuff that people haven't written about that matters. And the emotion was like,
Right.
just investment. Like, why has this been silenced? And I'm going to get it out there. And people were like, wow, like maybe it started as a social history, I have to say, and then it became this book about policy. Like I have a lot of stuff, as I said, from the congressional record. I looked at like McKinley's papers, a lot of stuff from political discourse. Um, and I felt like, okay, I'm sticking my neck out a bit on this, but the emotion was just the emotion of a young person who feels like, they're on to something that maybe I'm never going to get a job, but I think it matters, right? Is that an emotion, or is that just like what gets you up in the morning? Maybe that's not an emotion as a motivation, maybe.
Emotions get you up in the morning or not. So, Prof, thanks for that. And as I said, I'd like to give you the opportunity to add anything you wish, which could be something that's new to RAIN, to our conversation, or it might be something we've touched on that you want to traverse again in a different way.
Oh gosh. So maybe I'll use this for my own advantage. So you said before you started taping that some of your listeners are from Colombia and Mexico, and I have looked at Colombian documents. One of the things I love about our library collections is we have, and people who speak Spanish are going to laugh at me because I think I'm a little better at reading than speaking it, but Ministros de Obras Públicas. I have those volumes through our campus library and various engineering publications. And then in the US State Department records, they have a lot of printed government documents on like contratos and so forth from the region. So I have access to documents from the region I'm studying in my current work, but I have put my research trips on hold for now until I sort through my US stuff. So if anybody in your listenership has tips for me on US involvement in infrastructure building in the Caribbean area in the early 20th century and how it played out on the ground, I would love for people to email me, right, with the tips and to initiate conversations, because I feel like for every one of my books, I take a topic it turns out I know nothing about. So it's driven by curiosity rather than any kind of knowledge. And I always feel like I'm floundering, right? Like it's like how to figure out civil engineering, how to figure out the finances of it, right? Like how to figure out one of the things that happens is like, as I was talking about linkage, right? Linking economies, but it's also like you can't sell electrical appliances unless there's electricity, right? And you can't sell cars and trucks and locomotives and train cars and rails and so forth unless there are train systems and unless there are like highways, right? To run the cars and trucks on. And then once you build the systems, then not only does it grow trade and direct trade to the United States, in particular, because a lot of systems like led to like US ports and dominated ports, but it also leads to things like fossil fuel dependence, right? For countries that are not major coal producers or petroleum producers, or like in Mexico, the companies that own a lot of the petroleum production facilities are US companies. So then to run the cars and the trucks and the trains and so forth, you're importing fuels. Now I'm losing my train of thought. So, it's me figuring it out, right? Like, so to figure out like all the different parts of the story are just sometimes really challenging. And since I am on this fellowship, technically, although there's no money, and spending so much time on my own headspace, I'm not really talking about it very much with other people, except for you. So thank you very much, Toby, for having me on. But if there are people who want to talk about it, I would love to talk to people who, have stories or leads or insights or perspectives. So I guess that would be my final comment.
Wonderfully put. And if you want to know about the state and capitalism, you can't do better than public works, to be perfectly honest. So, Prof, thank you so much for being with us. Your work is terrific, and listening to you today has been a wonderful moment of instruction for me, and I'm sure for many others.
Well, thank you so much. It's been fun.